Kia ora everybody, and welcome back to Theology, where we drink tea and talk theology. We are drinking more Lychee Tea and continuing our discussion on the covenants. Now, over the past few weeks, we've been talking about covenants that were made between God and people, and a little bit of the historical context with these covenants and what covenants are. Today we are talking about another covenant between God and people, and I think this is quite an infamous, well-known one, that being the covenant between Abraham and God. Now, this covenant is detailed in Genesis 12 and then made, established, and redetailed in Genesis 15. This pattern I find kind of interesting because you see the same thing with Noah, where it's detailed in Genesis 3 and then made and confirmed and redetailed in Genesis 9. And there's quite a bit that happens in that space between the covenant first being presented and it being confirmed, and the same with Abraham. There's quite a lot that happens between chapters 12 and 15. I really encourage you to go away and just read that section of the Bible. It's quite helpful background for thinking about this topic. Now, this passage goes through and it details the covenant and also details how it's made and established. This covenant is also quite commonly called the covenant of the pieces. This idea, the covenant of the pieces, we've talked about a bit, which it comes from the idea of taking the animals and cutting them in half and someone passing through the pieces of the animal. This covenant ritual or tradition is one that is taken from the ancient Near East, so would have been how covenants were made and formed and established in Abraham's time. And the reason that this covenant is established in this way is because Abraham says to God, how will I know that this has come to pass? How can I trust that this is the truth? And God comes and meets Abraham where he's at and makes a covenant with him using the methods and rituals and traditions that mean Abraham can understand what the covenant is. Abraham is agreeing to be God's vassal, to give that undying loyalty and faithfulness to God. This covenant, the covenant of pieces, is one where the animals are cut in two, and one of the parties, and this is typically the vassal party, passes through them as if to say, if this covenant is broken, this is what happens to me. Now, this covenant can be broken by the suzerain for not holding up their end of the deal, what they promised to give to the vassal, and the party could be broken by the vassal for not showing faithfulness and loyalty to the suzerain. But it is the party who passes through the pieces that will bear the consequence for that breaking, and it is typically the vassal. There are a list of things that God is promising to Abraham. What are the promises that, if God doesn't fulfill them, will cause this to happen? And God makes a few promises here, and I find promises from God to be really interesting because if you think about it, they're kind of also prophetic, because it's God promising that this thing will happen in the future, and prophecy is us being given a glimpse into knowledge of what will occur in the future so that we can walk with God and be prepared and work towards that we have that hope. Now, with God, if all of his promises come true and he holds the future in his hands, then aren't his promises prophecy, and isn't his prophecy a promise? And it's that tension, because God holds the future in his hand, is him saying, I will ensure this will occur, which makes it prophetic. The promises that God has for Abraham is that he will give him the land that he's in, and that he will give him as many descendants, as many children, that being lots of children, as there are stars. Now, children doesn't necessarily mean directly his children, it means like generations. However, this is interesting because Abraham and his wife are quite old and they have no children. So how God can give them children, they're like, well, it hasn't happened so far. How does this covenant follow the formula that makes it a suzerain covenant? Because it's not just following their traditions. There are other things that must be required for God to be the suzerain and for Abraham and subsequently his descendants to be the nation, to be the vassal. So first off, it has to be initiated by the suzerain, and God initiates this covenant in Genesis 12, saying, I will give you this. And he is swearing an oath that he will give Abraham a son, and that he will have as many heirs as there are stars, and he also promises him the land. He is actually swearing the oath in chapter 15, though he initiates the covenant in chapter 12. And in chapter 15, he only gives Abraham blessings. So he only says, these are the blessings that you will receive. And he is then bound unconditionally as to that covenant. As we read through the rest of the Bible, we see that unconditional binding with Exodus and the fulfillment, and some of that fulfillment occurring, all of them coming from Abraham and having a nation of Israel come from Abraham, as well as them going out, leaving Egypt and going into the promised land, which happens in Joshua. So he is bound unconditionally to that fulfillment. This goes for his offspring. We see that as we read through, that God continues to uphold and uphold and uphold this promise. And this promise is one that was made to Abraham and therefore the nation of Israel, that this is what will be promised to you. And this type of covenant, this promising, is promised in return for the vassals' continued loyalty and the faithfulness that they are said to give God continuously because of this. However, because God never breaks his promises, he will never default on this. It is possible, however, for the vassal to default on this promise, as this promise will essentially last until God dies, because it carries on through generations and generations for the vassal, but it carries on only for that suzerain, and that suzerain is God. Typically, the vassal passes through the pieces as a way to say, this is what will happen to me if I stop showing loyalty to the suzerain. However, in Genesis 15:17, it says this: when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. If we're familiar with the way that God can appear in these passages, we know that he can appear and his spirit appears as fire and smoke. Here he comes in that kind of a spiritual appearance of fire and smoke and passes through the pieces. So this is God taking on the consequences for the covenant being broken, saying, let it be my body that is broken, I will bear the consequences for this. This covenant is broken by the Israelites. It is even broken by Abraham. However, God doesn't destroy all of them. God instead comes down and has his body broken on the cross as part of bearing the consequences for the breaking of the covenant. The cross symbolizes so much more and means so much more than just that, but that is one of the things that it is. It is God upholding the covenant that he made with Israel. And this covenant, like all of the other covenants that God makes with people, is pointing towards Jesus. There is still that prophetic element of Jesus in it, in the idea of the covenant being broken. God knew from this point, from the beginning of time, that Jesus would die on the cross. This is him taking on the weight of that breaking of the covenant. All the covenants have that idea of pointing towards Jesus in a new day. This is also the first covenant that God hasn't made for everyone. This isn't a covenant that is made for all of humanity. This is a covenant made for Abraham and his generations. This is the covenant that starts the nation of Israel. This is what will become a specific nation. In this way, we can see Abraham as a new Adam again. This is God making a promise with him that will start a nation. And God saying he will walk with him like he did with Adam. like he did with Noah. And instead of wiping the slate clean, like with the flood, he picked one person whose family and subsequent nation that will bear witness to him. However, when we read through Abraham's story, we again find that hope being questioned. Even reading the passages from Genesis 12 to 15, we see that hope beginning to be questioned. Is Abraham? We see God initiate this covenant with Abraham. We then read chapters 13 and 14 in Genesis, and we go, is Abraham really the guy for the job? Like, he seems a bit manipulative. He seems to not really trust God. He tends to take things into his own hands. Like, is he really the guy for this? But then we see God still form the covenant with him in Genesis 15. We go, well, God must think there's something there. God must think he's the right guy for this, even though he's done these questionable things. And then we keep reading the Genesis story and we keep going, really, God? This guy, the guy who just treated his servant and child like that and just kicked them out to die of starvation in the wilderness, the guy who keeps taking matters into his own hands and trying to deal with them. And, are we sure? But God is. And we see that really Abraham is just as broken as the rest of them have been. But God will still continue to use Abraham. And while this is the starting of something new, while Abraham is the beginning of something new, it still has that brokenness in it. The sin is still there. It's not the new creation. This brokenness is there and it lingers. However, the promise persists. God's faithfulness persists more than the sin and the brokenness does. It leaves us with a question though. How will God's faithfulness triumph? And with that, I'll leave you a question to think about. And thank you all for watching. Next week, we continue diving into the covenants that God made with people, looking more into Moses and nation of Israel. And I will see you all next week. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.